Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Geoffrey West, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. It's an honor to have you here. You're a very interesting human being, and I actually discovered your work, I think your TED Talk about 13 years ago or so.
Oh, yeah, my old
And
yes.
Yep, I actually revisited it yesterday just to catch up on it because
Oh,
it had been many years. And then I saw you speak. I don't know if you remember coming to Tempe, Arizona to do a little talk, maybe 10 years ago or something. I'm not sure when that was, but I saw you speak
yes.
live there.
I don't think it was quite that long ago, but it was quite a while ago. There was the opening of something, and I was asked to give a talk.
Yeah, I almost think it was something to do with sustainability, their program there, but I'm not
Yes.
sure. But anyway, I saw you talking there, and I just remember thinking, this is a really interesting human being who has perspectives that are not typical. And I don't think the average person has been exposed to your ideas yet. I think a lot of people in your world probably are very familiar with your work, but I thought it would be fun to try to share your ideas with more people because I think they're very important.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I suppose I also think they're important. Otherwise, I would be spending my time and my life on them. But no, and in fact, one of the important things for me is indeed outreach, is trying to get some of these ideas out there because I do think that they have some relevance to the kinds of challenges we're facing as we move well into the 21st century.
Absolutely. And things have rapidly changed even since you had your TED Talk with the
Oh,
ability to
absolutely.
have smartphones and podcasts. And
Yeah,
so it really
absolutely.
does create an opportunity to get people like you to reach a lot more people much more easily. So I love that about living today.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. Well, it also has its downside, of course.
It has
They-
its double-edged sword.
it is, well, inevitably. I mean, that's true of any great innovation. But,
Yeah.
but
Well, I would love to just start a little bit in with I remember you speaking about cities and scale, your book that you wrote, and it was a perspective shift for me because I had always heard, and I'm sure you're used to this, that people think that cities are bad and that they cause more pollution and that
yeah,
they're not efficient and that they're actually causing more harm on the planet. And as a general approach to this conversation, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you discovered when it comes to cities and how you get people together and ideas become these little social networks, and then
mhm.
cities become more efficient and actually have a less of a toll on the planet. So I'd love to start there if you don't mind.
Sure, yes, yes. That, of course, is not where I started. I mean, I started, thinking about the biosphere rather than the anthroposphere, so to speak. And but it took me into this whole question of cities, trying to understand cities, and then that led me to what you've very articulately summarized the two observations. Really, one was I had not appreciated, and it's sort of obvious when you think about it, the truly central role cities have in the future of the planet. I mean, that's obviously because that's where most people live, but also that it's happening at a faster and faster rate. It's not only is the population increasing at a faster and faster rate, or has been, I should say, um, but much of it is happening in an urban environment, and the planet is moving towards 75% being urbanized. It's now over 50%, and the United States we're over 80%, and that's true of much of the all the developed and developing world. Um, so that was the first thing that sort of I began to appreciate. The second was the point that you've raised that many of us have this image of cities as, in a certain sense, the origin of all the ills of society. And in fact, to some extent, that's true. On the other hand, they're also the place where all the great things of society have come from, all the great I mean, almost all ideas, all major innovations, our culture, to a large extent, has been bred in an urban environment. And so cities are this have this dual characteristic. It's almost like a schizophrenia. On the one hand, they are the font of all the great things that we love about modern life. It's given us a continuous increase in quality and standard of living, at least materially speaking. Um, on the other hand, it is the origin of pollution and inequality and so on and so forth, the various downsides of society. And one of the things that we discovered, and maybe we'll get into that later, is that they sort of balance each other curiously. I mean, in a very curious way, what you gain from all these wonderful things, you sort of lose with all these sort of negative, these good, bad, and ugly things that are the result of it. And we, as I say, we can maybe get into that later in the conversation. Um, but but one of the things that we discovered was that although, obviously the bigger the city, the more pollution it makes and the more impact it has on the environment and so on and so forth, on a per capita basis, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. On a per capita basis, actually, the bigger the city, the less its negative effects. I mean, those kinds of negative effects. On the other hand, the bigger the city, the more its positive effects per capita. So, in that sense, you're gaining by bringing people together, and you could even argue that in sort of the biggest picture you can think of about this, that's why we've been driven towards urbanization, because it's a net positive for us. And again, going to the point that you made earlier in the introduction, that all of this comes about because cities are this extraordinary machine, maybe the most extraordinary, wonderful machine that we've invented, almost inadvertently, um, uh, to create ideas, to create wealth, to innovate, in order to increase standards of quality of life. And it's done that by bringing people together. It's a great facilitator. It is, in fact, a machine whose primary purpose is, in fact, to facilitate and encourage and optimize interaction between people in terms of their social networks. Because the more social interaction you have, the more of these good things come about. I mean, wealth creation and ideas and so on and so forth. And I mean, the very, I don't know, the very dynamic of a city is one that produces, it's always producing ideas continuously, because every time people have conversation, they're producing ideas. But, you know, almost none of those ideas matter to anybody else, basically, and most of them sort of get lost. But the point is that dynamic is the very dynamic that produces the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics or a Google or an Amazon or a Toyota. I mean, that's it. And so it is this extraordinary machine. So that's sort of what is in sort of the broadest terms and in a non-technical language, what this work eventually sort of produced. Just to be fair, it wasn't that people hadn't thought of some things like this before. I mean, there's been a history of thinking about cities a long time, of course. I think the crucial thing that was brought to it by this work was to put it in, for want of a better phrase, a scientific framework, to try to make a science out of it.
I love it. Yeah, and I'm curious. I heard you say it's a machine, a city, but I thought for some reason you thought of it more as cities are like organisms. They're actually living and they outlive us. And so they're almost alive and they're like a super organism.
Yes. Well, I think they are. Yes. So I call it a machine, but of course you could call an organism a machine. I mean, it's maybe that's not the right word to use because it may connote the wrong image. It is an engine in the sense that it is processing energy and information and making an output that is highly useful, as you know, organisms do, and especially human beings. So anyway, that's so I don't know. I do use that image, and to some extent, but of course, it is, as you say, one of the things that it's been used in the past, of course, is to think of the city as a living organism, which it surely is. I mean, it has all of the characteristics one associates with an organism. But and indeed, the word superorganism has occasionally been used to describe a city. But one of the other things that came out of this work was, yes, the city has much in common, and in fact quite similar to an organism, to a human being, the individual human being, to mammals and so forth. But it's actually more than that. And that's what's so extraordinary about it. And it's more than that because it has built into it this extraordinary social network dynamic that when by bringing people together, A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks back to D, and we build on each other. We have this positive feedback that builds on each other. And things change. Things are continually evolving and adapting because of that. And that does not happen within an individual organism. Your cells are not doing that. They just go on doing what they're doing, sort of hopefully day in, day out, keeping you alive and metabolizing and so forth. But they don't change. I mean, in effective. I mean, there's some minor changes, but not on the scale and the time scale that we do changes. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and that was something that we discovered probably about 10,000 years ago with the invention of language, or maybe the discovery of language, and then so that we could communicate with each other and then have this fantastic phenomenon of building on each other and discovering economies of scale, that working together we can produce more in a shorter period of time than each of us working individually. But also the other thing that we discovered sort of a little bit later was agriculture, and so which allowed us to be sedentary. We didn't have to be wandering around hunting and gathering any longer. We could form communities, and very slowly that turned into cities, and now we're into mega cities and the extraordinary rate at which things are changing now.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the variables that when a city gets larger and more complex that make it more efficient and more
Sure.
sustainable and create less of a negative impact on the environment? And also maybe even talk about some of the negatives of cities too that have occurred that the bigger it gets to where it becomes not sustainable, or at least it can collapse over time, even though you say they're very hard to destruct.
Yes. Well, okay, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, just basically tell me your whole book in 1 hour.
yeah.
Just kidding.
So, let me just go back and say a little bit about. So, the book was entitled Scale. I mean, that was its main title, and it had some pretentious subtitle, but it was Scale, and because the idea of scale and the idea of scaling plays a central role in the work, and played a central role in the book, obviously. And that was to recognize that despite appearances, despite the fact that New York looks very different than Los Angeles, and they look different than Chicago, and they look very different from, well, you're in Phoenix, very different from Phoenix or Santa Fe, where I am. Despite that, if you look at the data, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment, if you look at the data, they're actually, to a very good approximation, scaled versions of one another, meaning that in terms of characteristics or metrics that you can measure about cities, if you plot them on a graph, they follow a very, very simple trajectory. And so in that sense, manifesting the fact that they are scaled versions of one another. And so some of those characteristics are things like wages, the number of AIDS cases, the amount of crime, the number of patents produced, therefore how inventive a city is, the number of educational institutions, whatever, anything that is either a material or socioeconomic metric where we could lay our hands on the data. If you plot that versus the size of a city, so we took the size of a city just to be its population, and you measure just measure these metrics: number of patents, amount of crime, et cetera, and you plot it logarithmically. Now, logarithmically, just so everybody's on the same page, simply means instead of plotting it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you plot it 1, 10, 100, 1,000. You go up by factors of 10. And in the first place, that's because you need to do that to get it all on one piece of graph paper, because if you go from a small town of 10, 20,000 up to New York City, that's that's quite a huge proportion. So to fit that on the same graph, you plot it in this logarithmic fashion. And what is fascinating is that when you plot it that way, the points lie pretty much on a straight line, which is kind of amazing. They all lie sort of lined up with one another. And the slope of those lines for socioeconomic quantities is about 1.15. What is remarkable is that it's about 1.15 for all of these socioeconomic quantities, whether they're good, like wages or GDP, or bad and ugly, like the amount of crime and so forth, or crime or disease, number of AIDS cases, and so forth. All of those have similar things. Now, why is that? Well, because all of these socioeconomic phenomena, if you dig deep, are all related to social interaction. They all come about because we're interacting. As I said earlier, that's what a city is. It's a facilitator of social interaction, and it's being beautifully manifested in these scaling graphs. And what is surprising is that the scaling is so simple, just follows this straight line when plotted in this specific way, logarithmically, going up by factors of 10. And what that says in English is that, very roughly speaking, is if you double the size of a city, you don't get sort of just twice as many patents. You get twice as many plus 15%. Or wages, you don't just get twice, the wage per capita. You don't get, you increase by 15%. So everything increases by 15%, including the ugly. You get 15% more AIDS cases than you would by just linear extrapolation. So that's quite fascinating, and it's to do with, again, the fact that as you keep adding people and the networks get bigger, you're getting more and more by about 15% of these interactions producing all of these phenomena. Now, the other side of that.
What are the?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I just had a quick thought, and I'm thinking about it as you go. I don't mean to interrupt, but it's important, I think, because I'm like, what if you're in a certain city or a certain society that has lack of free markets or lack of freedom of speech, certain ideological factors or political factors that hinder the flow of ideas having sex?
Yeah, very good question, and we don't know the answer. Well,
okay,
we do a
I'm
little
curious
bit.
about that.
In fact, what we wanted originally, we wanted to get data from the Soviet Union, if we could.
Yeah.
We never could get it. On the other hand, I have to tell you that most of the data we get from China falls on the same, doesn't look that different than the US. Now, most of that data is fairly recent data when China, despite appearances, is actually more, has moved much more into a free market-ish kind of system. I mean, they still call themselves communists, but I think it's a pale version of. It's still it's highly authoritarian and top down, for sure. But we know it has basically a kind of free market system. Otherwise, we wouldn't have problems with, TikTok and all the rest of these companies involving, they're not state companies, even though the state surely has a hand in them. So they're, and the data manifests itself in that way. It would be very interesting to get data, as I say, back to the old Soviet Union or back to Maoist China. And my guess is that you would see a difference. You would see, as you say, because you don't have the same kind of freedom of gathering, bringing together, and so forth. It was even though China is top down in certain political aspects, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to China. I've spent some time in China, and certainly the last time I was there, which was 2019, I was really surprised it had moved even further than it had from my previous visit, to the feeling of people feeling that they can mingle and interact and talk pretty much as openly as we can here, except about political issues. I mean, but issues that to do with, that you might loosely associate with entrepreneurship and ideas, did not feel that restrictive. But they certainly did in terms of, people very reluctant to talk politically. So it's a very interesting question, though. It's to be able to go back and see how that evolved. In fact, what would be fascinating to see how this scaling has changed, from 1948 when it became communist, all the way up to now, and the same way with the Soviet Union. If you could go back from the 1920s throughout the last 100 years and see how it changed until it became. Again, China's kind of similar. I mean, Russia's quite similar to China because it still is authoritarian and top down. But in terms of socioeconomic activity that is non-political, it's pretty open. It may not. It's not. I mean, nothing is like the United States. I mean, it's we're unique in a certain sense in our, I don't know, the culture of entrepreneurship, I would say. I mean. So anyway, no, as I say, we did think about that, but we were not able to really carry out the exercise. So anyway, so just going back to what I said, what that means is that on a per capita basis, social interactions increase with the size of the city, and therefore socioeconomic output from that, both the good, like patents and wealth, and the ugly, like crime and disease, all increase by roughly this 15% factor, which, if you go from a small town, I think if you do, it's interesting. So I hope I get this right. Santa Fe is about 100 times smaller than New York City, New York metropolitan area. Santa Fe metropolitan area, which is quite small, 150,000, is about 100 times smaller than New York metropolitan area, which is about 15 million. And all those socioeconomic factors increase. That 15% that you keep adding on as you go up translates into a factor of 2. So on a per capita, so you expect twice as many per capita patents from New York as you do from a Santa Fe, for example, and so on. So these are average quantities, and there are lots of variance, and you can see it when you plot the graph. You see these points lying on a line, but they all slightly off. Some are above, some overperform, some underperform, and so on, representing. And is that over and under performance that is really the distinctive feature of each individual city that represents its uniqueness, meaning its culture, its history, its geography, and so on. But at the 80-90% level, you give me the size of a city in the United States, I can, to sort of that 80-90% level, tell you how many police it has, how many violent crimes, how many patents, and so on. So there is a underlying dynamic that is at work that is common to all cities and dominates them. And that dynamic, just to repeat myself, is the dynamics of social interaction. And what we found that was fascinating was that it's not just the United States, the same law, in quotes, this what I'll call phenomenological law, is true, seems to be true across the globe. That is, when we looked at data in South America, Central America, could be thought of as a reflection of the fact that, it all comes from social networks, and social networks are not so different across the globe. I mean, our cultures may be different, but, we're all basically the same human beings. We all have the same DNA. We all sort of came from the same place. We may look a little bit different. In fact, just a side comment, I'm always amazed how incredibly similar human beings are across the planet. There's black people, and there's brown people, and there's people with different shapes of eyes. But the variation is so small when you think of what you could have. I mean, when you think of dogs, for example, the variation on dogs is phenomenal. But our variation is quite small, really. And it's reflected in this. It's reflected in this fact that this 15% is fairly invariant across the globe, and therefore representing the invariance of social interactions.
I love how you started to compare also the biology to the scaling factors of biological factors to the physics, and then the cities, and it's looking at organisms and then looking at cities as organisms in the biological
Yes.
factor. Can you go into some of those details about the size
Sure,
of a
sure.
mouse and then an elephant?
Yes. So, yes, absolutely. And in fact, this work, it's interesting, this conversation, because it's back to front to the history of this. The work that got me into this was, in fact, biological, was trying to understand this aspect of life. And in particular, I'm a physicist, and therefore I'm interested in the universalities, the things that are common across what appear to be differences, and things that don't change, like I just talked about a moment ago, the scaling laws for cities. That's what fascinates me, and to understand, not just to expose them, but to really understand what are the principles that are driving them, that lead to those laws. And that started out with biology because it had been known for, when I started working on this, it's been known for about 75 years or so, that there were these remarkable scaling laws in biology. And there was the most famous of which is called Kleiber's law, after a man named Max Kleiber, working at what is now University of California, Davis, in California. And he plotted a scaling graph of metabolic rate. So metabolic rate, roughly speaking, is the amount of food you need each day to stay alive. And he plotted that for a bunch of animals versus their size meaning just using their weight. And he discovered, just like I've just discussed in cities, if you plot it logarithmically, and there you surely have to do it. You have to go, in principle, you have to go from, if you're just stay with mammals, you have to go from a shrew, which is the smallest mammal, and is the smallest shrew is called the Etruscan shrew, and it sits sort of easily in the palm of a hand. And you go from that to a blue whale, which is bigger than, I don't know where you are, bigger than the building you're in for sure. And that's a factor of 100 million in weight. So you can't plot that on a simple graph, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 100 million. As I think I worked it out in my book, but you're in Phoenix, you might have to have a piece of graph paper that stretches to Tucson. I don't know. But so you have to plot it logarithmically to go 1, 10, 100, all the way up to 100 million. And he did that, and he found, just as I described in the cities, they lie on a beautiful straight line. And the slope there was 3/4, roughly, very close to 3/4, 0.75. And and that has extraordinary consequences, because it says it's less than linear. So what you might have expected naively, and you might have expected this naively in cities, that if you double the size of a organism, or double the size of a city, twice as many people, twice as many cells for an organism, you'd expect to have twice the metabolic rate. You'd have twice as much food to feed twice as many cells. Well, turns out that's not true. Turns out you only need 75%. There's this extraordinary economy of scale that is bringing these things together in a coherent, unified collective. Saves an enormous amount of energy, saves 25% for organisms each time you double the size, and that's enormous. I wish I could remember the numbers, but if you broke down, I don't think I will probably make a mistake, but I'll tell you the idea. If you took an elephant and you asked how many mice is that equivalent to, so you take the same biomass, the same number of cells, and I forget it. You can sort of imagine some humongous number of, mice, but the amount of food that humongous number of mice would need is something like 50 times what the single elephant with the same number of cells needs. So it's this 25% being compounded. So this is called Kleiber's law, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I want to now go to cities to complete what I said about cities, which is related to that. And this is the biological part of cities, the part that is just like biology, and that is its infrastructure, its physicality. And in fact, one of the curious things about cities is that when you start thinking about cities, if you talk to someone about a city, what do they conjure up? They conjure up the skyscrapers of New York, or the boulevards of Paris, or whatever. You have this buildings, roads, and general infrastructure. But as I said, that's sort of not really what a city is. Of course, it is what a city is, but the real point of all that is that it's there because of the people. It's the people that are the city, and that infrastructure is like a stage. It's a set to facilitate, as I've already emphasized, that interaction. So what about this physicality, the roads and electrical lines and so on? So that's very similar to our infrastructure. I mean, it's the roads, of course, are not so different from our circulatory system, except we have a beating heart, and we don't have a pulsatile flow in cities. But nevertheless, we have this kind of branching network systems inside us, which are distributing. The cardiovascular distributes blood, but what it's really doing is distributing oxygen and nutrients to the cells, and so all the other networks that comprise of an organism. In fact, in many ways, you could think of an organism as an agglomeration of networks at various scales, all interconnected and acting in unison. So a city is not so different in that respect. And what you discover is that for cities, that if you look at the infrastructure, like the length of all the roads, or the length of the electrical lines, or the number of buildings, or the volume of buildings, these all scale versus the size of the city, its population, not as the 1.15, but actually as 0.85. So it's like biology. It's less than 1, which, by the way, we call sublinear. Less than 1. It's 0.85. Biology is 0.75, but otherwise it's quite similar. In fact, if you look at all the graphs of infrastructure, they're quite similar to those of what we call organisms, except for this one crucial thing that every doubling you save only 15% rather than 25% you do for organisms. Nevertheless, it's basically the same kind of dynamic. And now go back to organisms. And it turns out, if you look, I just talked about metabolic rate, but it had already been discovered by the time I started thinking about this, which was the mid-90s. It had already been discovered following Kleiber that if you looked at any physiological characteristic of organisms, so like metabolic rate, but it could be something as mundane as the length of an aorta. This is the first tube that comes out of the heart, or or heart rates, etc., or anything to do with life history, like how long you live or how long you take to mature, how many offspring you have. If you look at any of these, there's probably 50 of them, they all scale in the similar way. They all look like that Kleiber's law for metabolic rate, and they all scale with slopes, the slope of that line being simple multiple of 1/4. So what was already discovered from the 1930s up to the post-war era was that these scaling laws are dominated by this number 4, 1/4. And this is called technically allometric scaling. So the work that I got involved with was trying to understand that. And I worked with two very good, there was a very distinguished ecologist named Jim Brown I worked with, and then a student named Brian Enquist. And I mentioned him because he's down the road from me. He's actually at University of Arizona in Tucson, and himself now a very established ecologist. But so the idea was that the origin of these scaling laws, first of all, I'm just going to talk about biology for the moment, lies in the physics and mathematics and general principles of these networks. So I won't go into that in any detail, other than to say that one of the major constraints that imposed on these networks is that the whole process of natural selection, the huge amount of time involved in by evolutionary process, the continuous sort of honing coming from feedback of the survival of the fittest kind of idea, leads towards systems becoming optimized, more and more optimized. So that was the idea. These networks are somehow optimized, and the fittest survive by optimizing those networks. So, for example, the network that the cardiovascular system that we all possess, not just we human beings, but all mammals and every mammal that has ever existed, the ones that we possess has evolved to be optimized by minimizing the amount of energy your heart has to do to pump blood through the network to feed your cells, so that you can allocate maximal amount of energy to sex and the rearing of offspring. So to push forward your genes, so to speak. So so that was the idea, and out of the mathematics and physics of all that, popped out this number 1/4. It derived from these underlying principles of the network, these scaling laws, and that was very nice. And then it led to all kinds of other things, like to understand growth, why it is you grow quickly in your early years and then stop growing. You can understand aging and mortality and so on and so forth. But now go back to what I was talking about for cities. It's very natural then to say that's where these scaling laws for cities come from. It is the fact that cities have evolved, albeit over a much shorter period of time. Therefore, it'd be much cruder, but to try to optimize something. They're moving towards optimizing something, and you have to then speculate, what is it that coming together as a collective and building these extraordinary edifices we call cities, what are we trying to optimize? Well, the two things that occur to one, first of all, just in terms of their physicality, once you built one of these things, you build them or they evolve such that on the average, each person, when they move from A to B, when they're taking their kids to school or going to the grocery store or the theater or whatever, going to work, are trying to do it in the fastest way. They're trying to get there as quickly as possible in the simplest way as possible, roughly speaking. Obviously, you can't go in a straight line, but you try to find a route that gets you there. And most of us do that, and that's sort of one of the things that is evolved in terms of the physicality of the city. That's the kind of idea. What about the socioeconomic side? Well, I would argue that has evolved primarily in order to maximize social interaction, because that's what the city is for, and therefore to maximize the production of wealth and ideas, and therefore, in some sense, without it sounding too pejorative, to maximize greed. We want more. And we see that because, that's an iPhone 14. I had an iPhone 6 until about a year or two ago, which was perfectly fine. But I have an iPhone 14, and I'm being urged to buy an iPhone 16. And people do, because they want more, and so on. I'm being a bit facetious. But that is sort of, without that, capitalism and entrepreneurship wouldn't work, of course, unless people do want more. They're not, very few of us run our automobiles or our refrigerators and so on totally into the ground. We're very open to getting things replaced well before their death time, their moment of dying. In fact, there's good reasons for that, but we tend to do it way before, typically. Many people, I don't know, I don't think it's so true now, but, I used to know many people I knew would get a new car every 2 years, some every year. Less so now because cars last are better, actually, than they used to be. Anyway, that's kind of a side point. Anyway, these are the ideas. The ideas on the physical side, you want to do things as quickly as possible. And on the socioeconomic side, you want more. Let's put it in simplest possible terms. And out of that kind of optimization come these kinds of scaling laws is the idea. So
it
biology,
seems very important that biological complexities of biology and the combination of mixing physics with biology. I'm curious, you must have teams of people that are biologists and then teams of people that are physicists, and they're all trying to share these ideas, which is, I've heard even like Andrew Marino, he's a biophysicist, and he goes, physics is doo-doo compared to biology as far as the complexity. He's like, it's just there's so many variables. But
absolutely.
Here you are seeing these underlying threads and these patterns that you can still see when you zoom out that high view to sort of keep going with what you were saying. I just wanted to bring that forth because it seems so important.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that's the point exactly. That when you look, I'm actually at home at the moment, and I'm looking out across a valley, and and I look, and there's all these plants and trees, and there's little, I know there's mice and coyotes and bears and there's all this stuff out there, and it looks kind of arbitrary and capricious. Looks like there's no structure and no regularity to it whatsoever. And so one is tempted to be totally overwhelmed by that. And indeed, much of science looks at the details of things, and science crucially advances by by reducing things to individual components or individual species, if it's biology, or individual systems or individual cities and so on. That's extremely important to do that. But equally important, and of course, from my viewpoint, in some ways more important, is to have the big picture, is to see beyond that, is to see the commonality, to see that despite what appears to be the individuality and the uniqueness of each, after all, each human being is unique and different. We look different, and you look different from everybody you work with. And we recognize that. Nevertheless, we also recognize that there's an extraordinary commonality. And I already talked about that a little bit earlier, but we know that we almost all of us have the same genes. It's a tiny weeny bit that makes us slightly different. So I'm interested in the bit that makes us all the same, so to speak, or at least using, there's a philosophical point here that in order to understand truly the differences, which is very important, it's also very important to understand what's the baseline for those differences. What is it that we all share? And then ask, how do we deviate from that? Each of us, whatever each is, each system, each city, each ant, each species, whatever. And so I think that's sort of the philosophical viewpoint, is to look at it as the invariant parts about which we see diversity and deviation. And we've actually done some work on that. One of the things that we did for cities, you can do this for any of these things, is you say, okay, that scaling line, which we believe we understand from underlying generic principles, is sort of represents the idealized city or the idealized organism. Now ask, look, you take an individual city, you take Phoenix, where does it sit on all these various things? Well, it's very close to that line, but it might be above it in terms of the number of policemen. So it's got more police than it, quote, should have for a city of that size. Or it has, when you look at the number of flu cases, it's just below the line. It had less flu cases and so on. So that's very interesting. That defines the individuality of Phoenix and also gives you a point of departure of asking why. Why, I don't know if this is even true, why does it have more police than, quote, it should? Why did it have less flu cases and so on? So we've done this for various metrics. One of the most obvious ones, we did it for patents. So you could ask, which says, okay, there's this line that forms the baseline, and how does each individual city do? Is it as inventive as it should be, given its size, or not? And of course, what we discovered was, I think it was number 2 or 3. It should have been number 1, but it was number 2, I think, was San Jose, California, because it has Silicon Valley. So not surprisingly, it was overperforming in terms of the number of patents it was producing. Now, patents, by the way, just a side comment on that, patents, of course, is a proxy for inventiveness or innovation. And of course, Silicon Valley probably was doing even better because many of those things never ever make it to the patent office. So anyway, so that's a side comment. That's always the problem with this kind of data, is that you have to believe in the credibility of the data as reported, and you have to understand what are the constraints that people have used in reporting that data, and so on and so forth. That's one of the difficulties, especially when you come to look at in countries, other countries where you don't, it's suspect. I remember the first data we saw from China, we looked it up, and we were just looking up, I think it had, there were cities of, 4 million that had zero murders, which was obviously rubbish. So obviously political reasons, people. Now, that's no longer true, by the way, about China. But, this was when we first looked in 15 years, 20 years ago, before we had access to good data. So that's one of the issues with this kind of work, is getting good data.
Yeah, it's neat to look at cities like just another form of nature because I've even had my own subjective experience of looking out from like the 60th floor in a high-rise building in New York
Yes,
City and
absolutely.
just seeing that high view with your imagination of like in one person's lifetime, if they live to be 105 years old, that much manifestation of this complex organism manifested in that one person's lifetime. It's so crazy.
Absolutely.
Or if you look at time lapse videos of cities at night and you can see them pumping and pulsating
Oh,
in
yeah.
the freeways and streets, it's so incredible. They look like an ecosystem, this
Oh,
living, breathing
absolutely.
ecosystem. It's
Absolutely.
amazing.
Oh, that's one of the best, actually, is if you can look at those time evolving pictures of night lights of an individual city, you can really see it just does look like a picture that you could imagine of picture of your insides, of your circulatory system pumping blood through. It's not so different. And in fact, it isn't so different. It's quite similar, in fact, to what's going on. And that's a good way of doing things. That's a good way of actually getting data. And in fact, people have tried to use night lights to extract data on both social activity and, in particular, economic activity as a metric.
Yeah. I love looking at those time lapse videos. And then I've also seen recently, there's a lot of new information. You've probably heard of this, of the mycelial networks that are underground of mycelium from mushrooms
Yep,
and how
absolutely.
complex and interesting and intelligent they are. And they're
Sure.
using them to map out cities to see if their intelligent networks can help us to design cities. Have you heard of this?
No, I've not heard that. I didn't know about that, but I certainly know about the mushroom networks and the
Yeah,
aspen
it's
network.
just
That's the other
fascinating.
one. Yeah. No, absolutely.
So,
No,
what are some of the implications that you've found throughout your life's work that you've come to find from writing the book Scale and seeing that these correlations happen that you can apply to sustainability and try to make
yeah.
things a little bit better instead of watching them go to the collapse state, which I think I've heard you mention could happen?
Yes. Well, that's a big one. And it's something that, even though, I mean, it's the thing that I'm most passionately interested in, actually, is to try to answer that kind of question, though it's extremely hard to answer. And, therefore, in terms of my actual working day, I do less on that than I do on the other problems associated with it, because that's such a big one. But so let me just go back. Let me talk a little bit about growth, because growth is crucial for all these systems. And certainly, it's obviously crucial for us, but it's crucial for cities and the economy. I mean, that's since the Industrial Revolution and the sort of evolution of capitalism, growth has become sort of a natural assumption that we should be expanding all the time, and in fact, it should be exponential. So let me just talk first about growth in biology, or growth in general. So the way this works in this framework is that and I'll talk about an organism first. You eat, that's your metabolism. You metabolize it. It goes through the networks, goes to the cells, and at the cellular level, some of that energy is allocated to repairing damage, and or replacing cells that have died, and some is for adding new biomass, creating new cells. And that's sort of a generic kind of equation, if you like, that you have an energy supply, metabolism, that gets allocated between, on the one hand, new growth, and on the other, maintenance. So it's very general, and you could think of it for almost any system. Now, in biology, you have this curious situation. that the bigger you are, the supply is actually decreasing per unit mass of biomass. I mean, because it's only going as 3/4, that slope is going as 3/4 as you increase size. But linear, the slope would be 1. I mean, if you were just keeping up with everything, the slope would be 1. The metabolic rate would just go linearly. That's what I said earlier. If you doubled the size, you would have expected double the metabolic rate. That's called linear, and that slope would be 1. But in fact, it's only 3/4, and that translates into the bigger you are, the energy per cell is decreasing. So your cells are working less hard than your dog's, but yours are working harder than your horse's cells. It weighs more. So what does that mean? That means the incoming energy is decreasing per cell, but you're trying to add cells at a kind of linear rate. And eventually you can't keep up with that. And so you stop growing. You can't keep up with the demand. In other words, the supply cannot keep up with the demand to keep growing in that kind of linear fashion. So you end up stopping growing, and that's why you stop. And there's a lovely theory you can develop, mathematical theory, that gives extremely good agreement with all the data on biological growth. And it gives rise, just to basically put in a slightly different language, it derives from these underlying network principles, the fact that you grow quickly at the beginning and then you stop. And it happens sort of automatically because of the constraint of the network making metabolic rate decrease in this sublinear fashion with this 3/4 slope of the metabolic rate. So that's good because first of all, it's good because it agrees with the data, but it's also good because it means that much of the biosphere is spending most of its time in a metastable state. I mean, for us, we grow for the first 15 to 18 years of our lives, and then we spend the next 60, 70, 80, whatever it is, in pretty much the same state, I mean, roughly speaking. And that is a very good model for sustainability. And that's one of the reasons why the biosphere has remained, I wouldn't say it's not stable, it's continually evolving, but why it has not collapsed. There's no collapse involved in that. And it's been around for 2-3 billion years. Now, let's do the same exercise for cities. We have a completely different situation now because the metabolic rate, instead of decreasing on a per capita basis as it did for organisms, is increasing because it was 1.15. It was superlinear rather than sublinear. So we have this superlinear scaling by this 15%. And so the bigger you are, instead of having less energy per capita, per cell in biology, you now get more energy per capita. Okay? So you're getting more social metabolic rate, let's call it that, social metabolic rate per capita, the bigger you are. But you're just growing in the same, and then you're adding new stuff. You're adding new individuals with all the stuff that is part of the individual, because, by the way, so I'm going to make one tangential comment. There's no such thing as an individual human being. You can't exist as an individual. You have to be part of the collective. That's who we are. We're truly and essentially and inextricably collective, a collective. Can't exist without it. So therefore, each of us carries around with us, so to speak, part of a refrigerator, part of a car, part of the roads, part of the airlines. That's who we are. That's us. And so that's what the social metabolic rate is contributing to. And so what happens is, instead of this thing growing quickly at the beginning, which it does, and then turning over and stopping, as it does in biology, becoming essentially stable. It just keeps going. So it's great. So in fact, this whole theory based on networks, is very satisfying in that sense, because it says, okay, everything is derived from social interaction. Social interactions have positive feedback mechanisms. More people, more interactions, therefore more wealth, therefore metabolic rate, the social metabolic rate is continually increasing faster and faster per capita. And therefore cities and therefore socioeconomic systems have open-ended growth, which is what we see. So it's very good. So it's a very nice and satisfying theory. However, it has built into it a very disturbing consequence, and that is that you cannot sustain that open-ended growth. That is that, in fact, the mathematics of it has built into it something that's called a finite time singularity, which means in English that in some finite time, the theory says, the theory which describes all of this and agrees very well with data, what it says is that eventually the socioeconomic quantities are going to become infinite, which is nuts. That is, you're going to have an infinite GDP, an infinite wages, infinite number of AIDS cases. Completely nuts. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But the theory tells you what happens. It says, yes, it is nuts. And in fact, the only way out of it is it collapses. The system just collapses. And so one of the things that we realized is the way that we've got out of it is, of course, to recognize that what this is based on, that little argument I just gave is based on, is that during that time of growth, sort of the fundamentals of the culture you're in remain fixed. I mean, what I mean by that is that if you grew up in the Stone Age, stones played a crucial role and that's why we call it the Stone Age, or the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age, or the Computer Age, or the Internet Age. We call it that because they dominate the culture. They were the major paradigm that sort of sets the background for all of this to happen. So given that idea, you realize the way out of that problem of collapse is that somewhere along the line, before the collapse, you better make a major paradigm shift. You better make a major innovation. You better discover, so to speak, computers, or the internet, or coal, or bronze, I don't know, whatever it is that changes. And because what that means is you can start over again. You can reset the clock, start over again, and off you go. However, of course, you have the same dynamic, and you're going to reach another point at which you might collapse. So therefore, you conclude that what has to happen is you have to have continuous cycles of major paradigm shifts or major innovations that reset the clock. Now, people have talked about that in the past, of course. That's kind of a canonical way of thinking about things. However, this is now a quantitative mathematical theory, and it has other disturbing consequences that people seem to have neglected. And that is that, yes, that's the way out, but unfortunately, you have to do it faster and faster, because the theory says that positive feedback that's continually happening as things growing also increases the pace of life, something I haven't talked about up till now. The pace of life inextricably gets faster the bigger you are. And by the way, tangential point, in biology, which had sublinear scaling and a highly sustainable consequence, you have the pace of life decreasing with size. You have this sense of, a shrew's heart rate is about 1,000 times per minute, and a whale's is about 15 to 20, and ours is about 60 in between. And so everything slows down, and that's why they live longer. A whale lives 120 years, and a shrew lives 1 to 2 years. Going back now to socioeconomic systems in the city, we have this problem that you're going to have to do things faster and faster. You have to innovate faster and faster. Life in general increases its pace. And of course, we all feel that. We know it, especially at my age. I'm 84. I'm actually 83. What's today's date? The 9th. In less than a week, I should be 84. So I've seen the pace of life increase extraordinarily in my lifetime. So I know it viscerally and anecdotally, but in fact, the data strongly supports that. And the theory certainly that's one of its consequences. So we have this problem that, yes, we can solve the issue of potential collapse by and avoiding this singularity by innovating, which is what the standard mantra, the standard canon is of economics, that the way out of any problem of exponential growth, which was first brought up, over 200 years ago by Thomas Malthus, and he was trashed for it because people said, look, you can innovate and change things, and they're right, absolutely right. And I agree with that. Malthus was wrong, technically speaking, but the point is you do not solve the problem, you postpone the problem. And in fact, you're making it worse because you got to do things faster next time, and the next time even faster, and the next time even faster than that. So that's a huge issue. So we developed this in the context of cities, but of course, now we come to the real question about global sustainability, which is really what we should be talking about, and that is that can we apply this to the globe? And when I first did this work, I thought, well, that seems a bit, the globe, a city, you can sort of argue could be thought of, even though it's heterogeneous, obviously, it can be thought of as roughly homogeneous on the big scale. But the globe is quite heterogeneous. I mean, my God, there are tremendous differences across the globe in standards of living and so on and so forth. And that was true. That's been true throughout history until now. Now we have, globalization, and it's remarkable that you can go anywhere in this planet, and it ain't so different. Everybody carries a cell phone. Everybody's doing, sending emails and texts, and everybody's doing, I don't know, TikTok or Facebook or something. I mean, everybody is interconnected in that way to varying degrees, but it's surprisingly similar. Whereas even in my youth, if I went to Africa, in 1950, it would be, it would feel quite alien. Whereas I was in Africa last year, and it did not feel alien. I mean, the standard of living wasn't so high as it is here, but it's pretty much the same, and so on. So that brings up the idea that maybe we can take this whole framework and apply it to the globe as a integrated system, as one thing, like a huge city, which is a stretch, but from what I've just said, it's not totally crazy. The other thing that happened was that in the meantime, I don't know when, maybe it might have happened during COVID, before COVID, but in the last few years, global data was collected, not by us. In fact, the man that spurned this is a man named Will Stephan, who was, I always call him Australian. Actually, he was an American who had emigrated to Australia and who died just about a year ago, who collected global data. And so he called it the Great Acceleration, because when you looked at any metric to do with the globe, not surprisingly, it looked like the population growth. It just went straight up, hockey stick. And but he collected all this data, and so we took the theory and applied it then just to the globe and this data, and amazingly, it agrees with the data, or the data agrees with the theory to a remarkable degree. First of all, sub- substantiating, I believe, the speculation that we're remarkably global now. It really is global. It's not. It's not. The data isn't quite as precise as that for cities, and the data is still very crude. Nevertheless, it shows this agreement, and it shows that we're heading towards a singularity. As you know, we are headed towards some kind of collapse unless we do something. Now, we the other thing this data showed, and this is not published, is that we avoided a singularity in the mid 1970s. Amazingly, that the data has a nice break in it in the mid 70s. And you can speculate about that. You can speculate that's when globalization sort of began a little bit. We had the big oil crisis, which probably maybe doesn't mean a lot to you, but certainly was hugely dominant in the mid 70s, was extraordinarily disruptive globally. Lots of other major things were happening in the mid 70s. So that's kind of interesting. So anyway, this work is very much a work in progress, and I think the takeaway message is we need both the kinds of things that are being done in terms of sustainability, looking at individual systems, being concerned about climate change, being concerned about sources of energy, pollution, blah, 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 etc. But we also need a big picture. We need some big framework that in order to understand this and bring it all together. And I think we will not solve it if we only focus on something like climate change. As crucial as that is, obviously we need to spend a huge amount of resources and energy trying to understand climate change, to what extent it's real, to what extent it's anthropogenic, to what extent it's going to affect the future of the planet, which it seems to be at the moment. We need to do that in great detail, but we also need a big picture and to recognize that's just one manifestation of this whole phenomenon. And where does it come from? Climate change comes, of course, from cities. Cities are the origin of climate change because that's what's produced all this huge amount of excess energy, which is affecting the planet. The planet's on fire. I mean, that's what all the energy we use is just burning up the surface of the planet, and so that is clearly produces some form of change in climate. But that's the climate change is just one of those manifestations. All these other things have to be brought into a more unified, holistic picture, and we also have to relate it back to the fact that all of this is derived from the dynamics and structure of our human social networks. So that's the kind of thing I'm sort of thinking about now, among many other things. But that's the one, to be honest, if I could, that I ought to be spending most of my time on. I mean, I would like to be spending most of my time on.
I love it. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. There's so many threads there, but I'm seeing people, you probably know these folks pretty well, Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil, their ideas of the singularity and Peter's idea of abundance being just seems unsustainable. He always seems to have this idea that, give me your opinion of what his idea are, with abundance.
I only know Kurzweil's ideas a bit.
Mm.
I have to say, I mean, because I've used his data actually to substantiate. In fact, what's interesting, he had this data on the singularities that he had in his book. I think it must have been. And what is nice is this theory reproduces that line, that the slope of that line of the past singularities or the potential singularities, because they weren't singularities actually. But I think he has a misconception about singularities, and I think it's really. I mean, I vaguely remember, and I hope I'm not. I may be wrong. Someone may have to correct me. When I read his stuff, which is quite a long time ago now, he was predicting by now we'd already have cyborgs and we'd already be on our way to this glorious future and so on. Now, this may well happen, eventually. I mean, we don't know, especially now with AI, machine learning, and so on. Who the hell knows? I don't know. I'm skeptical, frankly, but I mean, I was skeptical about AI, and I've been enormously impressed at its power, even though the hype is ridiculous. I mean, and somehow this idea that it's like an oracle. It's like going to the oracle at Delphi, and you put in a question, and then the universe responds, and this is how you're supposed to do things. Of course, we will certainly collapse if we rely on AI to do everything. Then I think that I'm willing to make it some 98% surety. If we only relied on AI, we're in deep doo-doo, frankly. But but AI is unbelievably powerful and will be crucial for understanding many of these issues. But at the moment, we still need the ingenuity of the human brain, the creativity of human beings, and so forth. Um, so I'm skeptical of much of this stuff, I have to say, and that may be because I'm an old fart, and I have a very conservative view of science and progress. And I've seen too many other things. I mean, you don't have to go back very far when nanotech was going to be, everything was going to be solved and so on, or even the Human Genome Project.
Mm-hmm.
Once we map the human genome, no more disease, all going to be great, and blah, blah, blah. So all these things come along with a huge hype. And that's partially because, well, some of it is because of commercial interests, of course, but some of it is just because people remain very narrow-minded sometimes. They stay so much in what they're doing that they are not interacting with people outside of that domain, that they lose sight sometimes. I mean, I love their enthusiasm. By the way, don't get me wrong. I love when people do something extraordinary like that. Their enthusiasm is very important, and we need that. It's just that, unfortunately, it gets exaggerated and exponentiated by other interests, and AI is one
Yeah.
is the biggest. I mean, so who knows? But AI may be. So going back to this thing of avoiding collapse, AI could be as something as mundane as electric cars or self-driving cars, but it could be something as sophisticated as AI will be the next major paradigm shift that will save us for a bit. But there'll be another one in 10 or 15 years we're going to have to do that's as big. Well, it's hard to see you can continue that. Very hard to see that that's sustainable. And I think we need a different kind of innovation because, innovation will solve these problems. But my feeling is that one of the problems that's occurred in the last 20, 30 years or so is that the word innovation has become completely dominated by the idea of technology. When we say a new innovation, we think of a new technology, whereas innovation is much broader than that, and it's very likely that to avoid collapse, we need a cultural or social innovation of some kind that will change the way people think and do things together collectively and so on. And that's much harder to accomplish.
Yeah, it seems like more of a conscious paradigm shift culturally that would be most advantageous. It's hard to imagine how, but even on the micro level of the individual, you just start to get older and realize, like, okay, if I keep just buying more things, I'm not going to get more happy. It just creates more
Right.
headaches and more. It's a runaway hedonic treadmill, and you start to see that these markets and these businesses now are incentivized. Not only social media and these companies, but to capture attention, so then you hire psychologists and different people to market those ideas to just create this
Absolutely.
speeding up of consumerism whether it be
Absolutely.
an attention economy or just a consumption economy. And I think that if we could see a paradigm shift, it would be for us to recognize or even use film or some sort of art to help us to see the situation that we're in that would cause the younger generation that's not so conditioned to be able to maybe recognize and have that disgust factor kicked in. to where
Yeah.
each newer generation gets disgusted by what the old generation did. And then they want to create and use their technological and innovative means to build a world that is more sustainable or has more orientation towards less of what they saw was sort of disgusting from the generation before.
Yes, no, I wish that something like that might happen, but sadly, there are so many interested forces to fight that are very
Hmm.
powerful. I think it's very hard. I'm quite skeptical, unfortunately, about whether we're able to do that.
So, yeah, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world that you think is most valuable to share?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's a toughie. Um, well, there are two things that I feel give meaning to life. One is love, and that as hard as it is to try to love. I mean, it sounds simplistic, um, but to have a loving relationships and to heed. I'm not religious. I'm not a Christian, but to love thy neighbor as thyself, kind of be inspired by some version of that. To respect the collective and that you're part of the collective. I think that's very important. And I say that because so much today has become individualistic, and our politics has become very much focused on that, and the idea of out for oneself. We need that. Everybody's out for oneself to some degree, but also to recognize the role of that you're part of something that has been developing for a long time, and that you can contribute in some very small way to that. So that's one thing. The other is that is sort of related, I suppose, is to recognize that understanding is crucial, and that's what I feel. I feel the only the only point that of the universe is that there's part of it that can be conscious and look for understanding and for meaning in that understanding. And we're it as far as I can tell. So let's not waste it. So that's sort of what that's sort of off the top of my head what I would like to pass on.
I love
Oh,
it.
you,
That's beautiful.
you,
Yeah,
you
the golden rule. Well, I appreciate you sharing your time today, and
sure.
it was really special to capture some of you and share it with some people that maybe have never been exposed to your work before.
I appreciate it. By the way, so you're in Phoenix, right?
Yep.
And you told me you're a firefighter, which was very intriguing.
Yes, I've been doing it 19 years now.
Oh my God, that's fantastic. So, how come you got into this?
Oh, I was a young man and God, I wanted to do something exciting and help people, but I also remember seeing the fire department my freshman year of high school. I saw a kid cut his whole hand off in woodshop class. It was pretty
Oh my
crazy.
God. Oh my
And I
God.
saw the fire department respond, and they were so calm and collected, and they mitigated the emergency really well. And I think that was the first time I saw something
Um,
that was traumatic and also handled with people that could manage it really well. And I thought, man, maybe I could do that because I was pretty calm in that situation. And so I
uh-huh.
think it just aligned well with who I am.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's great. And what made you interested in doing things like this podcast and so on?
Well, I'm a consumer of podcasts since they began. I think since 2010 or so, I
Yeah.
just love to learn. I'm a I'm a wonder junkie. That's actually the name of the show. I love to learn,
Is that
and
right?
started to realize how many people don't have access to certain people's ideas, and one of them is an elder friend of mine. Her name is Retta, and she's in her 70s, and I just wanted to
Yeah.
capture her before she died, and that was what inspired me to buy the equipment and
Oh,
to start capturing people
very
and
good.
sharing ideas.
Very good. Very good.
So,
Well done.
yeah.
Well done. That's
Well,
very,
thank you.
very okay. Well, thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate it. It was fun chatting with you. And
Yeah, I thank you very much. It was really
thanks,
fun. Yep. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll be in touch.
Likewise, likewise. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.